The Crythian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 5,000 years. Their ships were massive beyond human understanding, some as large as Earth's moon, others stretching for miles in every direction. They had conquered 400 worlds across 2 galaxies, and not once had they failed to bring a civilization to its knees. Their technology was so advanced that most species surrendered the moment they saw the fleet appear in their skies. The Crythians didn't negotiate, they didn't compromise, and they certainly didn't tolerate defiance. Every world that resisted was reduced to ash and served as a warning to others. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, the Crythian fleet emerged at the edge of Earth's solar system. There were 3,000 ships, each one bristling with weapons that could crack a planet's crust or boil its oceans. Admiral Jack Bennett was the first human to see them on the deep space scanners. He had spent 30 years in the Earth Defense Fleet, fighting pirates and settling disputes between the Mars colonies and the lunar settlements. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. He stared at the display screen in the command center beneath Colorado, watching as more and more red dots appeared on the tactical map. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered in his chest like a war drum. Within an hour, every screen on Earth flickered and changed. Televisions, computers, phones, even the giant displays in city centers all showed the same thing. A creature appeared, tall and thin, with gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. It had 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on its face, and when it spoke, the words came out in perfect English, Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and every other language simultaneously. This was Ambassador Vector of the Crythian Empire, and his message was simple and brutal. Earth had 72 hours to surrender. The terms were non-negotiable. Every government would dissolve and pledge loyalty to the Emperor. Earth would become a tributary world, sending resources and technology to the Empire. 30% of the human population would be taken for labor conscription, sent to work in mines and factories across the Empire. Any resistance would result in complete extermination. Vector's 3 eyes showed no emotion as he delivered the ultimatum, as if he were reading a grocery list rather than condemning billions of people to slavery or death. When he finished speaking, the screens went dark. Panic spread across the planet like wildfire. Cities descended into chaos as people rushed to stores, emptied banks, and fled to anywhere they thought might be safe. Governments struggled to maintain order while their leaders scrambled to figure out what to do. Some politicians immediately called for surrender, arguing that survival was better than extinction. Others demanded that Earth fight, even if the odds were impossible. The arguments raged in every parliament, every Congress, every council chamber around the world. President Helen Morrison had been in office for 2 years. She was 53 years old with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many compromises and too many half measures. She had been elected on a platform of unity, promising to bring Earth's fractured nations together after decades of climate wars and resource conflicts. Now she faced a decision that would define humanity's future. She called for an emergency session of the United Earth Council in Geneva, demanding that every nation send its highest representative. The council chamber was a circular room with seats for 200 delegates, representing every nation and major colony in the solar system. The mood was tense as Admiral Bennett took the podium to present the military situation. He pulled no punches and offered no false hope. Earth had 50 warships, built over the past 20 years as humanity had expanded into the solar system. They were good ships with brave crews, but they were designed for patrol duty and minor conflicts, not for war against an empire that had conquered half the galaxy. Bennett's voice was rough from years of shouting orders over engine noise and weapon fire. He explained that the Crythian ships were larger, faster, and carried weapons that humanity couldn't match. Earth's missiles would barely scratch their shields. Earth's railguns would bounce off their armor. A direct confrontation would last maybe 3 hours before every human ship was debris. Some delegates began to weep, others sat in stunned silence, and a few stood up to demand that Bennett find a solution, as if wanting something badly enough would make it possible. That's when Dr. Lisa Hoffman appeared on the main display screen. She was calling in from the Mars Research Colony, where she had been working for the past decade on projects that most people didn't know existed. Hoffman was 46 years old with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. She had 3 doctorates in physics, engineering, and military strategy. She also had a reputation for pushing ethical boundaries in pursuit of scientific advancement. Hoffman told the council about Project Inferno. 10 years ago, when sensors first detected unusual activity at the edge of the galaxy, a small group of scientists and military leaders had begun preparing for the possibility of alien contact. They hoped for peace but planned for war. Project Inferno was the result of that planning, a program so classified that only 50 people in the entire solar system knew it existed. Hoffman and her team had been developing weapons based on human history's darkest chapters, taking every terrible thing humanity had ever created and making it worse. She described nuclear weapons that could generate temperatures matching the surface of stars. She talked about relativistic projectiles fired from mass drivers hidden on the moon, moving so fast that nothing could stop them. She explained quantum-entangled communication systems that would allow Earth to coordinate with resistance movements across the entire galaxy. She outlined plans to turn Earth's sun itself into a weapon, triggering solar flares that could consume an entire fleet. The technology was terrifying and brilliant in equal measure, born from the understanding that humanity couldn't win a fair fight, so they would have to fight dirty. The chamber erupted in arguments. Half the delegates were horrified at the weapons Hoffman described, calling them crimes against nature and violations of every treaty humanity had signed. The other half demanded to know why these weapons hadn't been deployed already. Hoffman waited for the noise to die down before she spoke again. Her voice was calm but carried an edge like a knife blade. She explained that using these weapons would cost millions of lives, maybe billions, and Earth might still lose. But the Crithians would learn that conquering humanity meant paying a price that would make them wish they had never come. President Morrison called for order and then asked for a vote. The question was simple: surrender or fight. Every delegate knew what surrender meant: slavery for 30% of humanity and subjugation for everyone else. But they also knew what fighting meant: the possibility of extinction. The vote took 3 hours as delegates consulted with their governments, their advisors, and their consciences. When the final tally came in, it was unanimous. Not a single nation voted to surrender. Morrison stood and addressed the council with a speech that would be remembered for as long as humans existed. She spoke about courage and defiance, about the value of freedom and the cost of submission. She reminded everyone that humans had always fought against impossible odds. From ancient warriors facing empires to revolutionaries toppling tyrants to explorers venturing into unknown darkness. She said that humanity had reached the stars through determination and sacrifice, and they would not give up now just because the enemy was bigger and stronger. Then Morrison did something that shocked everyone. She opened a direct channel to the Crithian fleet and addressed Ambassador Vector personally. Her voice was steady and her message was clear. She told him that humanity rejected the ultimatum and would not surrender under any circumstances. She explained that humans had a saying about live free or die, and they meant it. She warned Vector that if the Empire wanted Earth, they would have to take it by force, and the cost would be higher than anything they had ever paid before. She finished with words that would echo across the galaxy. "We are humanity and we don't kneel, so come and take what you think you can." The transmission ended and the council chamber fell silent. Every person there understood what had just happened. Earth had declared war on the most powerful empire in known space, and there was no going back. The Crithian fleet moved into Earth's orbit exactly 72 hours after the ultimatum expired. Commander Zethrak led the invasion force from his flagship, a vessel 3 miles long that had participated in 40 successful planetary conquests. He expected to find Earth in chaos with governments collapsing and populations rioting in the streets. He expected to see desperate military forces making last stands at strategic positions. He expected panic and confusion and the sweet smell of defeat that always came before a world accepted its new masters. Instead, he found nothing. Every military installation on Earth appeared abandoned. Satellite scans showed empty bases with no heat signatures and no power readings. The orbital defense platforms that had been detected days earlier were gone, either destroyed by their own crews or moved to unknown locations. The 50 warships that Earth called a fleet had vanished completely, leaving no trace of where they had gone. Even the civilian traffic that usually filled near-Earth space had disappeared. It was as if someone had taken a broom and swept every human vessel into hiding. Zethrak had been a military commander for 70 years, and his instincts screamed warnings that something was wrong. Planets didn't go silent like this, and military forces didn't simply vanish. He ordered his fleet to proceed with caution, and activated every scanner and sensor array available. His officers searched for any sign of the human fleet or hidden weapons, but their instruments showed nothing except empty space and a quiet blue planet spinning peacefully below. The first mine detonated 16 minutes after the fleet entered Earth's orbit. It had been drifting in a debris field that sensors had classified as harmless space junk, just another piece of broken satellite or discarded rocket stage. When the Crythian heavy cruiser passed within 50 meters, proximity sensors triggered the device. The explosion was like nothing the Crythians had ever encountered. Instead of a conventional blast or energy discharge, the mine generated a nuclear reaction that released more energy in 3 seconds than some stars produced in an hour. The cruiser's shields were designed to deflect laser fire and absorb kinetic impacts. They were not designed to withstand temperatures that matched the surface of a sun. The shield generators overloaded instantly. The hull plating melted like wax, and the internal atmosphere ignited as fusion fire consumed everything. 1,200 Crythian crew members died before they understood what was happening. The cruiser broke into 3 pieces and tumbled toward Earth's atmosphere, leaving a trail of debris and frozen bodies. Zethrak stared at his tactical display in shock. In 40 conquests, he had never lost a ship during the initial occupation. He immediately ordered the fleet to scatter and activate maximum shields, but it was already too late. Dozens more mines had been drifting in calculated positions, waiting for targets to come within range. They began detonating in sequence, each explosion creating a sphere of nuclear fire that vaporized anything nearby. That's when the human fleet appeared. Captain Danny Foster commanded the EDS Valiant, a frigate with a crew of 200 men and women who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they would never see home again. The Valiant and 49 other human ships had been hiding in the debris field around Saturn's rings for 3 days, running silent with all systems at minimum power to avoid detection. They had waited in the cold darkness while the Crythian fleet passed them, and now they were behind the enemy formation with clear firing solutions. Admiral Bennett's voice came through on the command channel, calm and steady despite what everyone knew was coming. He gave the order that every captain had been waiting for, and suddenly the darkness of space lit up with engine flares as 50 human warships activated their drives and accelerated toward the Crythian fleet at maximum velocity. The Valiant was not a large ship by any standard. It was designed for patrol duty and escort missions, with barely enough weapons to threaten a pirate vessel. But Foster and his crew had spent the past 3 days loading every available space with nuclear torpedoes, fusion missiles, and experimental weapons that Dr. Hoffman's team had developed. The ship was essentially a flying bomb with engines attached. Foster targeted the nearest Crythian destroyer and fired everything he had. 6 nuclear torpedoes streaked across the distance at speeds that made them nearly impossible to intercept. The Crythian point defense systems managed to destroy 4 of them, but 2 got through. They struck the destroyer's engine section simultaneously, and the resulting explosion tore the ship in half. Secondary explosions rippled along the hull as fuel tanks ignited and ammunition stores cooked off. All across the battlefield, the same scene repeated itself. Human ships diving into the Crythian formation like wolves attacking a herd. Each human vessel knew it was on a one-way trip and fought accordingly. They didn't try to survive or retreat. They simply dealt as much damage as possible before the inevitable end. Lieutenant Karen Mills watched from Earth's command center 3 miles beneath the Rocky Mountains, her face illuminated by the glow of tactical displays showing the battle in orbit. The Crythians had never faced nuclear weapons before, because no other species had been crazy enough to develop them. Most civilizations discovered cleaner energy sources before they figured out how to split atoms, and those few who did discover nuclear reactions typically used them only for power generation. The idea of deliberately creating an uncontrolled nuclear explosion as a weapon struck most species as insane, like setting yourself on fire to keep warm. But humans had always specialized in insane ideas that somehow worked. The Crythian shields were sophisticated, pieces of technology that could deflect energy, beams and absorb kinetic projectiles without any problem. They worked by creating a field that redirected or absorbed incoming energy, spreading the impact across the entire shield matrix. But nuclear weapons didn't just hit with energy. They generated temperatures and pressures that exceeded anything the shield designers had anticipated. When a nuclear warhead detonated against a Crythian shield, it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a fishing net. Ships died by the dozens as human torpedoes found their marks. Cruisers exploded, Destroyers broke apart, and even some of the larger capital ships suffered critical damage. Zethrak shouted orders to his fleet, trying to organize a response, but his forces were scattered and confused. They had been trained to fight organized battles with clear battle lines and tactical doctrine, not this chaos of suicide attacks and weapons that treated shields like they didn't exist. The human fleet didn't last long. The Crithians had numbers and firepower that no amount of courage could overcome. The EDS Valiant survived for 18 minutes before a Crithian energy beam cut through its forward section and destroyed the bridge. Captain Foster died instantly, along with most of his command crew. The ship continued fighting on automatic systems for another 3 minutes before a barrage of plasma fire reduced it to expanding gas and twisted metal. One by one, the human ships fell. The EDS Liberty took 7 Crithian vessels with it before succumbing to overwhelming fire. The EDS Constitution rammed a Crithian battleship when its weapons ran dry, penetrating the enemy hull and detonating its remaining nuclear warheads inside the target. The EDS Independence fought until its hull was so damaged that atmosphere vented from 100 breaches, and still it kept firing until a lucky shot hit the reactor and turned the ship into a brief new sun. 3 hours after the battle began, 47 of Earth's 50 warships were destroyed. Only 3 survived the engagement, and those were so heavily damaged that they could barely limp to the Mars shipyards for repairs. The Crithian fleet had won the battle, but the cost left Zethrak staring at his casualty reports in disbelief. 300 ships destroyed. 300 ships out of the 3,000 he had brought to Earth. 10% of his entire invasion force wiped out in a single engagement against an enemy that should have been crushed in minutes. He had lost more ships in 3 hours than he had lost in 40 previous conquests combined. Thousands of Crithian crew members were dead or drifting in the void, and the surviving ships were low on ammunition and fuel. Zethrak composed a message to the Emperor, carefully explaining what had happened and requesting reinforcements. He described the nuclear weapons and the suicidal tactics, trying to convey the sheer insanity of an enemy that would sacrifice everything just to make you bleed. He warned that conquering Earth would require more resources than any previous campaign. The Emperor's response came back 6 hours later, brief and brutal. The message contained new orders and a reminder that failure was not tolerated in the Crithian military. Zethrak read the orders 3 times, hoping he had misunderstood, but the words were clear. The Emperor was sending 5,000 additional ships to Earth's solar system, and together they would reduce the human homeworld to ash. On Earth, President Morrison addressed the planet from a secure bunker in Geneva. She spoke of the sacrifice made by Captain Foster and the thousands of crew members who had given their lives in orbit. She didn't try to hide the losses or pretend that victory was certain. The Crithian Empire responded to their losses with overwhelming force. 5,000 warships began converging on Earth's solar system from every corner of the Empire, pulled from garrison duties and patrol routes across 2 galaxies. The Emperor himself issued the command that Earth would be made an example, a warning to any species that might consider resistance in the future. Every ship carried orders to show no mercy and take no prisoners. But Admiral Bennett and Dr. Hoffman had anticipated this response. Project Inferno was never just about building weapons or winning battles. It was about transforming humanity into something the Empire couldn't comprehend. A civilization that would burn everything, including itself, before accepting chains. The second phase of the plan was more ambitious and more dangerous than anything humanity had ever attempted. Lieutenant Commander Amy Wright worked in the hidden construction facilities beneath the lunar surface. She was 34 years old with engineering degrees from 3 different universities and hands that were permanently stained with machine oil. For the past 8 years, she had been overseeing the construction of mass drivers, enormous electromagnetic cannons built into the moon itself. The project had consumed billions of dollars and required moving enough rock to hollow out spaces the size of skyscrapers, all while keeping the work hidden from any potential observers. The mass drivers were simple in concept but devastating in practice. They used powerful electromagnets to accelerate projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed, fast enough that relativistic effects became important and kinetic energy approached infinite levels. Each projectile was a solid slug of depleted uranium weighing several tons, wrapped around a core of fusion warheads. When Wright received the signal from Earth Command, she activated all 30 mass drivers simultaneously. The moon shook as the drivers fired. Projectiles launched from carefully calculated positions, each one aimed at a different section of the approaching Crithian fleet. The slugs crossed the distance between the moon and the enemy formation in seconds, moving so fast that they appeared as brief streaks of light. The Crithians detected them too late to respond. Their shields, already weakened from the previous battle, couldn't stop projectiles with that much kinetic energy behind them. A Crithian capital ship, one of the massive vessels that served as the backbone of their fleet, took a direct hit from one of Wright's projectiles. The slug punched through the forward shields like they were made of paper, penetrated 12 decks of armor plating, and detonated its fusion warheads deep inside the ship's core. The explosion consumed the vessel from the inside out, and for a brief moment a new star burned in Earth's sky. 19 more capital ships died in the first salvo, and the Crithian advance staggered. On Mars, Colonel Paul Henderson commanded the orbital defense stations that humanity had secretly built into Phobos and Deimos. Henderson was a career military officer who had spent 20 years moving up through the ranks, always wondering if he would ever see real combat. Now he commanded a weapon system that would have given nightmares to military strategists from any era. The 2 moons of Mars had been hollowed out over a decade of secret construction, transformed into giant weapons platforms disguised as natural satellites. When Henderson gave the order, both moons revealed their true nature. Massive doors opened on surfaces that had appeared dead and barren, exposing weapon systems that had been built in anticipation of this exact moment. The stations fired clouds of superheated plasma generated by nuclear reactions, spreading out in patterns designed to catch as many targets as possible. The plasma moved slower than Wright's relativistic projectiles but covered a much wider area, creating kill zones that no ship could safely navigate. Crithian destroyers and cruisers tried to dodge the plasma clouds, but there was nowhere to go. The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing ships to choose between different death sentences. Some captains tried to push through the plasma at maximum shield power, hoping their defenses would hold long enough to reach clear space. Their shields failed within seconds and the ships melted like candles in a furnace. Other captains tried to retreat, only to find more plasma clouds behind them as Henderson adjusted his firing patterns. The Crithian fleet lost another 200 ships in the Mars engagement, and their morale began to crack. These weren't warriors who had signed up to face impossible odds and suicidal enemies. They were soldiers of an empire that had always won, that had never experienced real resistance, that had forgotten what it meant to fight against someone who refused to accept defeat. They had expected Earth to fold like every other conquest, and instead they were bleeding from 1,000 cuts. But the real surprise wasn't the weapons or the tactics. It was what Dr. Hoffman had been preparing in secret for the past 3 months. While the military fought to slow the Crithian advance, Hoffman and her team had been building something that would change the entire nature of the war. They called it the Quantum Network, a system of communication devices based on quantum entanglement that allowed instant communication across any distance. Hoffman had sent small teams to 60 worlds across the Crithian Empire, all of them planets that had been conquered and subjugated by the Crithians over the centuries. The teams traveled in disguised civilian vessels pretending to be merchants or refugees, and made contact with resistance movements that existed on nearly every occupied world. They distributed the quantum communicators and explained how to use them, then waited for the right moment to activate the network. That moment came when Earth sent a single message across all 60 channels simultaneously. The message was brief and carried a power that surprised even Hoffman. It said that Earth was fighting the Crithian Empire and winning, that the invincible fleet was bleeding in Earth's solar system, that resistance was possible and victory was within reach. The message ended with an invitation to join the fight and strike at the Empire, while its attention was focused elsewhere. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 60 worlds answered Earth's call, species that had been conquered decades or centuries ago, that had accepted their fate and learned to live under Crithian rule, suddenly remembered what it meant to be free. Resistance cells that had been dormant for years activated and began hitting targets across the Empire. Supply depots exploded, communication hubs went dark, and garrison forces found themselves fighting insurgencies on planets that had been peaceful for generations. On the industrial world of Kelthor, a species called the Draenei rose up against their overseers. They had been working in weapons factories for 80 years. building the very ships and guns that kept them enslaved. Now they turned those weapons against their masters. Governor Tekmil of Kalthor sent desperate messages requesting reinforcements, but there were no reinforcements to send. Every available ship was either heading to Earth or dealing with rebellions on other worlds. On Veska, a mining colony that produced rare elements essential to Krithian shield technology, the indigenous population sabotaged the extraction equipment and collapsed the main mine shafts. Without those elements, the Empire couldn't repair damaged shields or build new ones. On Horthon, a scientific research station, the conquered species released a computer virus into the Krithian military network that corrupted navigation data and weapons targeting systems. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the Empire. Each successful uprising inspired others, and the quantum network allowed resistance movements to coordinate their actions and share intelligence. For the first time in 5,000 years, the Krithian Empire found itself fighting on dozens of fronts simultaneously, and they didn't have the forces or resources to suppress all the rebellions at once. Ambassador Vektar, who had delivered the ultimatum to Earth with such confidence, now stood before the Emperor trying to explain how everything had gone so wrong. The Emperor was a massive creature who had ruled for 3 centuries and never experienced anything but victory. His 3 eyes burned with rage as Vektar described the situation. 60 worlds in open rebellion, the fleet crippled, supply lines disrupted, and all of it traced back to a single planet that should have surrendered without a fight. The Emperor made a decision that would define the final phase of the war. He ordered every available ship to Earth's solar system with instructions to destroy the planet completely. No occupation, no subjugation, just total annihilation. Earth had to die so that other species would understand the price of defiance. Vektar tried to argue that this might only inspire more resistance, that making martyrs of the humans could backfire, but the Emperor silenced him with a gesture. 12,000 warships began moving toward Earth. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the known galaxy, pulled from every corner of the Empire at the cost of leaving other systems vulnerable. The Empire was betting everything on crushing Earth so completely that no species would ever dare to resist again. On Earth, President Morrison received the intelligence reports about the incoming fleet and understood that this was the endgame. President Morrison made the hardest decision any human leader had ever faced. She authorized the complete evacuation of Earth. The announcement went out on every channel and in every language, giving humanity 48 hours to board any vessel capable of reaching escape velocity. The message was simple and brutal. Earth was going to become a battlefield that no one could survive, and anyone who stayed behind would die. The panic that followed was unlike anything in human history. 8 billion people trying to escape a planet with only enough ships to carry a fraction of that number. Captain Linda Ross commanded a civilian cargo hauler called the Horizon, a ship designed to carry mining equipment between Earth and the asteroid belt. She had a crew of 30 and space for maybe 200 passengers if they packed people in like cargo. Within 6 hours of the evacuation order, 5,000 people were camped outside her ship's boarding ramp, begging for spaces that didn't exist. Ross made decisions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took families with children first, then the elderly, then anyone with critical skills that humanity would need to survive. She watched people cry and plead and offer everything they owned for a seat on her ship. She watched soldiers hold back crowds that threatened to rush the ramp and overwhelm the ship's capacity. When the Horizon finally lifted off with 5,000 people crammed into every available space, Ross could still hear the screams of those left behind echoing in her mind. The evacuation fleet was a desperate collection of everything that could fly. Luxury yachts designed for wealthy tourists cruised alongside industrial mining vessels. Cruise ships that normally carried 1,000 passengers now held 10,000. Ancient cargo haulers that should have been scrapped years ago were pressed into service with prayers and hope holding them together. The fleet scattered into deep space with orders to run as far and as fast as possible, to ensure that somewhere in the galaxy, humanity would survive. Admiral Bennett stayed behind with 10,000 volunteers. They were military personnel, engineers, scientists, and civilians who understood what was coming and chose to face it anyway. Their mission was to turn Earth's solar system into a killing field that the Krithian Empire would never forget. They had 6 days before the main enemy fleet arrived, 6 days to prepare the greatest ambush in human history. Every asteroid in the belt received a team of engineers who attached engines and nuclear charges. Every planet's orbit was seeded with mines that would activate when Crythian ships came within range. The surviving ships from the first battle were repaired just enough to fly and loaded with every weapon that could be scrounged from Earth's abandoned arsenals. Bennett coordinated it all from the command center beneath Colorado, working 20-hour days and sleeping in a chair when exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. Dr. Hoffman worked in the solar research station that orbited closer to the sun than any permanent human facility should. The station was protected by experimental heat shields and cooled by systems that consumed enormous amounts of power. But even with all that protection, the temperature inside was barely tolerable. Hoffman and her team were implementing the final phase of Project Inferno, the piece of the plan so dangerous that they had hoped never to use it. They were going to weaponize the sun itself. Engineer First Class. Greg Palmer was 31 years old and had a daughter named Sophie, who was aboard the Horizon with his wife. He had volunteered to stay behind so his family could escape, and now he worked alongside Hoffman to complete the solar detonation sequence. The theory was simple, but the execution was terrifyingly complex. By using precisely timed nuclear explosions at specific points in the sun's magnetic field, they could trigger a coronal mass ejection, aimed like a gun at whatever coordinates they chose to. Palmer's hands moved across the control panels with practiced precision as he armed the devices that would generate the trigger explosions. Each one was carefully positioned based on months of calculations and simulations. If they got the timing wrong by even a fraction of a second, the sun might become unstable and consume the entire inner solar system. If they got it right, they would unleash a wave of stellar fire that would make nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. The Crythian fleet arrived on schedule, 12,000 warships emerging from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. They came prepared for anything humanity could throw at them, with shields at maximum power and weapons armed. They came with the intention of reducing Earth to a lifeless rock and ending human resistance forever. They came expecting victory because the Empire always won, and Admiral Bennett gave the order, and hell itself opened up to greet them. Asteroids that had been drifting in predictable orbits suddenly activated their engines and began accelerating toward the fleet. The Crythians destroyed dozens of them with long-range fire, but there were hundreds of asteroids coming from different directions, and each one carried enough nuclear warheads to devastate multiple ships. The ones that got through the defensive fire detonated in massive explosions that overwhelmed shields and armor alike. Mines hidden throughout the solar system began activating in sequence, creating a gauntlet of nuclear fire that the Crythian fleet had to navigate. Ships that tried to dodge the mines ran into more mines. Ships that tried to push through at maximum shield power found their shields failing under sustained nuclear bombardment. The careful formation that the Crythians had maintained began to break apart as captains made individual decisions about how to survive. The human ships, what was left of them, emerged from hiding spots throughout the system and attacked with the same suicidal determination that had characterized the first battle. They were badly outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the advantage of fighting in their own territory against an enemy that was already taking heavy casualties. Captain Victor Kane commanded one of the 3 surviving warships from the first battle, a destroyer so heavily damaged that half its systems were held together with emergency welds and desperate prayers. Kane led his ship straight into the heart of the Crythian formation, firing everything he had and targeting the largest vessels he could find. The battle raged for 6 days as the Crythian fleet pushed deeper into the solar system. They lost ships with every mile they advanced, but they kept coming because the Emperor's orders were absolute. By the time they reached Earth's orbit, they had lost 8,000 of their 12,000 ships. 2/3 of the most powerful military force ever assembled had been destroyed by a species they had expected to crush in. Ours Commander Zethrak survived the journey to Earth's orbit, but his flagship was so damaged that half the crew was dead, and the other half was running on emergency life support. He had started this campaign with pride and confidence, certain that adding Earth to the Empire's list of conquests would be a routine operation. Now he commanded the shattered remains of a fleet that had been humiliated by an enemy that refused to die quietly. The Crythians began their bombardment of Earth with weapons that could crack continents and boil oceans. They fired everything they had at the planet below, determined to reduce it to ash and fulfill their Emperor's command. The attacks continued for 18 hours as the surface of Earth burned and the oceans began to steam. Cities that had stood for thousands of years vanished in seconds. Mountains were leveled and valleys were filled with molten rock. Admiral Bennett watched from his command center as the planet above him died. He had known this was coming and had made peace with it, but watching it happen was still almost unbearable. He thought about all the history being destroyed, all the art and music and literature that would never be recovered. He thought about the billions of people who hadn't made it onto the evacuation ships. Then he activated the final sequence and sent a message to Greg Palmer at the Solar Research Station. Palmer received the signal and looked one last time at the picture of his daughter that he kept on his console. Then he initiated the solar detonation sequence. The nuclear devices positioned around the sun's magnetic field exploded in a precise pattern that had taken months to calculate. The sun's surface convulsed as massive amounts of energy were suddenly released in a directed beam aimed straight at Earth's orbit. The coronal mass ejection that followed was like nothing the galaxy had ever witnessed. A wave of superheated plasma and charged particles erupted from the sun, moving at millions of miles per hour and carrying enough energy to power human civilization for 1,000,000 years. It crossed the distance to Earth's orbit in 8 minutes, and when it hit the Crythian fleet, it was like hitting insects with a blowtorch. Shields designed to withstand nuclear weapons couldn't even slow down the plasma wave. Ships that had survived everything humanity had thrown at them simply ceased to exist as the stellar fire consumed them. Zethrak had 1 second to understand what was happening before his flagship, and everything in it was reduced to its component atoms. 4,000 Crythian warships died in the solar eruption, and the few that survived were so heavily damaged that they couldn't even maintain orbit. 3 years after Earth's fall, Captain Linda Ross stood on the bridge of the horizon and looked at what humanity had become. The ship that had once been a simple cargo hauler was now the flagship of the Free Humanity Fleet, leading a collection of 300 vessels that ranged from military warships to converted passenger liners. The 5,000 refugees she had carried away from Earth had grown into a community of 2 million scattered across a dozen colony worlds, and more survivors were being found every month as the evacuation fleet slowly regrouped. Ross was 41 years old now, with gray streaks in her hair that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She had watched Earth burn from a distance of 2 light years, receiving the final transmissions from Admiral Bennett, and seeing the recordings of the solar eruption that consumed the Crythian fleet. She had cried for days, mourning the billions left behind and the world that humanity would never see again. Then she had dried her tears and gone to work building something from the ashes. The most surprising thing about the aftermath was that humanity wasn't alone. The 60 worlds that had risen up during Earth's fight had won their freedom as the Crythian Empire collapsed into chaos. Without the military strength to suppress rebellions and with their reputation for invincibility shattered, the Empire had fragmented into a dozen smaller factions fighting each other for control. The species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly found themselves free, and many of them reached out to the scattered human survivors to offer thanks and assistance. Ross received a transmission from New Terra, the colony world where the largest concentration of human survivors had settled. Governor Steve Collins reported that representatives from 40 different species wanted to meet with human leaders to discuss forming a new alliance. Collins had been a mid-level administrator before the evacuation, managing agricultural projects on Mars. But the crisis had thrust him into leadership, and he had risen to the challenge. He explained that the other species saw humanity as liberators and wanted to build something better than the old empire. The meeting took place on New Terra in a hastily constructed conference center that could accommodate the wildly different biology of 40 species. Ross attended as the military representative alongside Collins and a dozen other human leaders. She sat in a room with beings that breathed methane, beings that communicated through color changes, beings that existed as hive minds, and beings that looked so alien that human eyes struggled to process their shapes. The representative from the Drenai species, who called herself Krenna, spoke first through a translation device. She explained that her people had worked in Crythian weapons factories for 80 years, building the tools of their own oppression. When Earth's message came through the quantum network, asking them to rise up, they had been terrified. But they had seen the recordings of human ships fighting impossible odds, had heard about Captain Foster and the Valiant, sacrificing everything to strike at the Empire, and they had found courage they didn't know they possessed. Now they wanted to ensure that no species would ever be enslaved again. One by one, the other species told similar stories. The Empire had taken their freedom, their resources, their dignity, and crushed any hint of resistance for generations. They had learned to accept their fate because fighting seemed pointless against such overwhelming power. Then humanity had shown them that the Empire could be hurt, that sacrifice had meaning, that freedom was worth dying for. Earth's destruction had become a rallying cry across the galaxy, and now billions of beings were free because humans had refused to kneel. The conference lasted 3 days and resulted in the formation of the Free Worlds Alliance. It was a loose confederation built on principles of mutual defense and respect for sovereignty, the exact opposite of the Empire's structure. Each member world would maintain its own government and military, but would come to the aid of any other member under attack. Humanity would provide military training and share the weapon technologies that had proven so effective against the Crythians, while the other species would help rebuild human civilization and provide resources for the scattered survivors. Dr. Lisa Hoffman attended the conference as humanity's chief scientific advisor. She was 50 years old now, and had survived the evacuation by being at the Mars research facility when the order came. She had spent 3 years helping establish industrial capacity on New Terra and developing new technologies in cooperation with scientists from other species. The combination of human innovation and alien knowledge was producing remarkable results. Ships that could travel faster, weapons that hit harder, and defensive systems that incorporated lessons learned from the war. Hoffman stood before the assembled representatives and presented her latest project. She explained that while Earth's surface had been devastated by the Crythian bombardment and the solar eruption, the planet itself still existed. Automated probes sent to the solar system had detected something unexpected. Life was returning to Earth. The nuclear fire had sterilized the surface but hadn't destroyed the planet's core or atmosphere. Bacteria and simple organisms had survived in deep ocean vents and underground caves, and they were slowly spreading across the dead world. In a few centuries, maybe a millennium, Earth might be habitable again. The news sent waves of emotion through the human delegates. Ross felt tears running down her face as she thought about distant descendants walking on Earth's soil, breathing Earth's air, and knowing the stories of those who had sacrificed everything. Collins proposed that the Alliance commit resources to monitoring Earth's recovery and eventually helping to restore it. The other species agreed immediately, seeing it as a debt they could never fully repay. Lieutenant Maya Clark commanded the EDS Phoenix, humanity's first new warship built after the evacuation. She had been a junior officer on one of the ships destroyed in the first battle, surviving only because she had been on shore leave when her vessel launched for its final mission. The Phoenix was smaller than the old Earth Defense Fleet ships, but incorporated technology from a dozen different Alliance species. It had Draenei shields, human nuclear weapons, Vesicon engines, and sensors designed by the Horthon. Clark took the ship on patrol along the borders of free space, protecting trade routes and responding to distress calls. The remnants of the Crythian Empire still existed in pockets throughout the galaxy, warlords and commanders who refused to accept that their civilization had fallen. Some of them tried to rebuild the old empire through force, attacking isolated worlds and attempting to re-establish tributary relationships. The Free Worlds Alliance responded to each attack with overwhelming force, demonstrating that the age of conquest was over. Clark and the Phoenix participated in a dozen such actions, always making sure that any Crythian commander who tried to enslave others paid a steep price. President Helen Morrison led the provisional government from New Terra, guiding humanity through the difficult process of rebuilding. She was 56 years old and looked 70, aged by the weight of decisions that haunted her dreams. She had authorized the evacuation knowing that billions would die, had approved the solar detonation sequence that destroyed Earth, and had made 1,000 other choices that saved some lives at the cost of others. She met weekly with counselors who tried to help her process the trauma, but some weights could never be lifted. Morrison gave speeches to human settlements across Alliance space, reminding them of who they were and what they had accomplished. She spoke of Admiral Bennett and Captain Foster, of Dr. Hoffman's terrible weapons and Greg Palmer's final sacrifice. She talked about the billions who had died on Earth and the duty of survivors to ensure their deaths had meaning. She challenged humanity to build something better than what they had lost, to become worthy of the price that had been paid for their freedom. On the edge of former Crithian space, a small exploration vessel called the Discovery carried a mixed crew of humans and aliens into uncharted territory. Engineer Pete Turner worked alongside Caress, a Crithian who had defected during the collapse of the Empire, and Milana, a Vescan scout whose people had been enslaved for 200 years. They explored new star systems, made contact with previously unknown civilizations, and carried a message of cooperation instead of conquest. Turner kept a small container of Earth soil in his quarters, one of the few samples that had been preserved before the evacuation. It was just dirt, nothing special except for what it represented. Sometimes he would open the container and touch the soil, remembering a world he would never see again. Then he would close it carefully and return to work, knowing that Earth's legacy wasn't just destruction and sacrifice. It was also hope and the promise of something better. The Crithian emperor who had ordered Earth's destruction was dead, killed by rivals in the civil war that consumed his empire. The new leaders who emerged from the chaos understood that the old ways were gone forever. Some of them approached the Free Worlds Alliance to discuss terms of peace, acknowledging that humanity and their allies had fundamentally changed the galaxy. Others retreated to isolated systems and nursed their hatred, dreaming of the day when the Empire might rise again.